Hello, dear guests and subscribers to my channel. Thank you for following our new releases and new streams with Alexey Arestovich. Hello, Alexey. Good evening. All right, friends. You are watching us live on both channels. And if you want to ask a question or support any of us, then next to me, down at the bottom, there is a QR code where you can both ask a question and support my channel. And we'll start this session with Q&A today with those that you asked. And QR code below the right side of the screen under Alexey. This is the link to his school, to his School of Speech, Psychology and Logic. And the next seminar that he has lined up is pretty interesting. It's actually about women. So if you're curious, follow through. And in our today's stream, everything will be as usual. We'll first talk a bit, and then we'll give a mic open to our listeners, and we will bring a bunch of questions that you guys have asked during this week. And as our communication goes, we will talk to the chat live as well on both channels. All right, let's start with the usual poll question. Today, the question is a bit philosophic. Important, in the spirit of time. If Ukraine will be no more, then the world will A. Win. 2. Lose. 3. Not notice. 4. What the heck, Ukraine will be forever. Alexey, we'll talk about other things, but let's ask you first that same question. What do you say? Oh, I think the world perhaps will be upset for a couple days, maybe 3 days. We'll write about that in the news, and then we'll adapt to the new reality. So the world will notice it, right? Oh yeah, it will notice. Perhaps there'll be a conversation for the whole week or even 3. Okay, guys, please continue voting. We'll come back to this topic, to the topic of existence of Ukraine and how it will be. But let's start with the main epic and somewhat disturbing news. Both sides exchanged strikes this week, and yesterday Ukraine was rather successful in its drone attack in Russia, and we were concerned what will happen in Turkey, Istanbul. However, Istanbul meeting went fine. Both sides exchanged memorandums. They even started exchanging prisoners of war. Turkey also came out and said that Fidan talked with Rubio and agreed that they will be talking once again, all sides, so sometime by the end of the month. And we're starting to see that Istanbul is gradually evolving from the platform and the place where we were discussing peace to a place where both sides just meet and chat. So, in your view, do you think Ukrainian attempts this week to blow up the railroad bridge to Crimea, to destroy dozens of Russian strategic bombers, were they aimed at destroying or disrupting Istanbul negotiations? Okay, Alexandra, look, when the operations were planned, nobody knew that Istanbul negotiations will be on a certain day in a certain month. Because, sure, when they tell us that these things were being prepared for a year and a half, these are fairy tales. But they definitely were preparing these for at least half a year, maybe 9 months. And when that ball started rolling, nobody knew when Istanbul will happen. So this is a different logic. This is a military logic of unfolding and managing an ongoing operation. But I do want our listeners to understand that there was no direct intent to disrupt negotiations when the operation was conceived. But what could have been done, they did not have to execute on the week of Istanbul Agreements meeting. Operation was already prepared, but you can always move it a couple of days, one way or the other, or even for a week sometimes. Even if you have a very brave diver with 1,000 kilos of explosives hugging one of the pylons of the bridge, you can always move the date. You can talk to your smart dolphin and ask him to swim for a couple more days and then blow later. But that was not used. That was not done. That's what I'm saying. Not that we wanted to disrupt Istanbul from the beginning, but we did not delay the operations when we could. And Istanbul negotiations did not bother our side to conduct these operations. We conducted some right before, we did another one the day of, and some right after. Why? This is the logic of going into the summer-autumn campaign of battle actions. The goals from Russian side are rather clear: complete capture of Lugansk, Donetsk, and some more territories, with preparing another ultimatum by autumn. And they will be talking about Zaporozhye and Kherson districts as well. And since there would be more motions up north with a buffer zone, and the buffer zone is not just to isolate Russian territory from incursions of Ukrainian forces, it also creates additional zone for further advancement as for the future. Basically plans to say that, hey, if you will misbehave, we will continue cropping up your territories and biting them off on all sides. And this is the logic of military. So if there'll be no agreement happening in summer, then the entrance into winter campaign will be to be done at the most advantageous positions for Russian side. Pure military logic. The rules of strategy and no politics there. Political component of interest is another one, is that our leadership did not pause these operations during Istanbul negotiations, did not conduct them a little sooner or a little later. And the second component is that this slap in the face did not bother Russian delegations to come to Istanbul. And Putin has not been too loud about that. And I can comment a bit more here, that other story. If you want, I can talk more about it. Of course, Alexey. We actually were hoping to talk to you yesterday. Well, sorry, Alexander, I was flying. I was in the sky at the time, so I'm here today. So Russians actually do behave as adults in this situation. When we sunk in April of 22 their flagship Moscow, they were not bothered to conduct negotiations the next day with us. Same Medinsky, same delegation, talking the same topics. Additionally, they suffered a rather significant military defeat near Kiev, Chernigov, near Sumy and Kharkov. At that time, the whole northern group, to say the least, has not fulfilled their tasks. They were withdrawing with losses. They've lost about 75% of command of paratroopers. They only had some success in the south, near Melitopol and Mariupol. But in the north, they were slapped pretty hardly. So what did Russian delegation do? They did not only not withdraw, they continued giving us compliments as the fighting side. It was difficult for them, but they, through their clenched teeth, were acknowledging that, yes, you guys can fight back. And now a question, an open question. Can you imagine a Ukrainian delegation or a member thereof who is giving compliments to their vis-a-vis at the negotiations, to the Russians? Well, wait, Alexei. As we are discovering now, Medinsky and Amirov were talking for 2.5 hours before the official session. Well, definitely not exchange of compliments, Alexander. There was one person who was giving occasional compliment and congratulating with a birthday if somebody had a birthday during the negotiations, and was giving the mic to the general to start talking because he was of the lieutenant colonel rank himself. But that person was removed from the negotiation group because he was not an easy member to continue pushing the line that Ukrainian delegation is pushing. Do you think it was difficult for Russians too? Oh yeah, it was difficult for Russians to communicate with me, for sure. They were pushing on their own things and I was not letting them have their agenda. And they used Belarus to make me step out. Belarus started anti-terrorism case against me, and the Russian delegation said, well, we cannot be negotiating with a person under investigation. So I had to take a step back, and my chair was slightly out of the frame during the remainder of negotiations. So I was still there, but I was not in the limelight. And Russians they have an understanding of diplomacy, an old school understanding. They do not call you names. They do not misbehave. They do not make strange outbursts during negotiations. They're rather cordial and to the protocol. And frankly, it is much easier to deal with them than to deal with Ukrainian delegations that very often behaves like small children. We've talked on a different stream with Bondarenko about one of these examples of Ukrainian delegation. We have a rhetoric in the country that talks about 20,000 disappeared Ukrainian kids. And on the negotiations, we're only talking about 320. And Russian side is actually asking, give us parents, show us that you have parents of these kids, we will return the kids to you. So I participated in 3 different negotiations of different formats in Minsk, in Istanbul, and in Normandy format. So I saw representatives from OSCE from different countries. I've seen our speakers, I've seen Russians, different speakers, different leads for different negotiations. And my conclusion, it's much more difficult to deal with Ukrainians. It's a mix of hype, chutzpah, stand-up show, PR opportunities. Very unreliable, not professional, and very, if I'm using the right word here, prostituting. What I mean by that is that try not to go deeper into the symbolic and psychological meaning. Let's say it is when people, to obtain immediate benefits, they give up very big elements of ethics or goals. It's, for example, when the leader of the country comes out and calls the other side idiots. This is what I call prostituting, when he is using public resources in personal goals, to achieve personal goals. This is technically a description of corruption. When you use the public capital, including symbolic capital, you're the leader of the country at war, it depends, your behavior will define whether prisoners, whether the bodies of soldiers will be returned, and you cannot find anything better than to hype on the problem, perhaps strengthen your political rating just by including that extra expletive in your speech. You did not have to, right? But starting all the way from the top of leadership of Ukraine, that public capital is being used to support, to obtain additional political resources for the current Ukrainian leadership. Alexey, whom are they hyping with, do you think? Do they do it in front of Russians, in front of, for the Western audience to see? Because, see, I was reading the statement by Peskov, I reread it 3 times. It was very amorphous, very neutral about Zelensky. There is no name calling, there is no actual bickering. So Zelensky was left alone in the room with that word idiot that he used. Remember when near St. Nicholas Cathedral Russians hit the Kiev and all the politicians walked nearby under cameras and they used all the last words to attack Russia? This is what I imply being prostituting. When to achieve immediate goals, they forego much bigger goals and achievements. And when a president comes out and calls the other side names, after which more ballistics fall on the heads of his citizens, this is a wrong story. But that tells me that people have lost their moral bearings and they do not understand what is beneficial and what is not long-term for them. What do Russians do? They still remember how adults behave. Doesn't matter how many strategic bombers we would have bombed, a dozen, 40, even 2 would be a big achievement. Yet they still came to the negotiations. Because if we are in the negotiation track, And of course, there are both sides. There is protocol negotiations in Istanbul, and there are also the closed negotiations happening. And if we are on this track, and it's a separate question how successful it is and where it goes, but still, they made a decision to participate in it. Even, I think, a direct hit on Kremlin would not have cancelled it, because the country made a decision to go this way. What does Ukrainian side do? Our favorite one. They continue using every tool in their toolbox. Turn left, turn right, jump, powder the face, throw a tantrum, do anything and everything to make sure that nothing serious would come out of it, of the negotiations, that there would be no serious results. Alexey Nikolaevich. So, besides children, where instead of thousands, we apparently are looking at 339 kids to be specific. We Ukrainians live in that, and we see how Yermak and Yelena Zelensky are writing this topic that we will bring our kids back. Here are the t-shirts, logos, campaign, talks in different parliaments of Europe. They put some t-shirts on Austrians and some other, but turned out to have an unintended consequence, because I think the night of Sunday to Saturday, or Saturday to Sunday, Ukraine got 150 kids from Austria back to Ukraine, orphans, the ones who have no parents anymore, whose parents died. And Austrian powers are saying, well, listen, we've been taking care of them, but we can do nothing. We got an order to send them back to Ukraine. So they were put in a bus and brought back to the country at war. Right? So they returned the kids, right? From Austria. And here one can ask probably the main question. Medinsky, who destroyed this PR campaign on kids by actually asking about exact last names and numbers, Austria, that is returning kids to the country at war where UAVs and ballistic missiles are getting dropped on the heads. And we are getting our kids back to Ukraine from Europe, not from Russia. What for? Where to? Who's the target audience? Well, this is the style of Zelensky administration, the style of this Houthi dictatorship. Same, for example, as we had called Fort Bakhmut, right? One military friend of mine who has access to secret documents, he's saying that the cost of Bakhmut is 20,000 dead on our side. That number needs verification, but that's the number he did quote. This is the price of that PR campaign. Well, Alexei, I'm somewhat used to communication with you, and I'm sorry for talking about you in a third phase now. But I remember you were saying that you were going to name some numbers when the war will be heading to an end. Right, Alexander, I think we need to know truth even before the finals, because I think they may lose the same amount, maybe 3 times that, on 3 other PR projects of Fort somethings, and they will continue doing that until somebody stops them. This number does require verification. The argument that this is an acquaintance of mine cannot be taken seriously in public sphere, but I'm using it to make people think. Could be more, could be less, but I want to remind how did the Fort Bakhmut appeared from the PR side. On the tactical side, Bakhmut was a very poor place to defend. And there was a time there when the losses, 1 for every 5 Russians attacking the fort, the area, we were losing 1 to 5, and at some point it went 1 to 1, and then later it basically became even more losses on the Ukrainian side, because everybody who came to Bakhmut were erased with big air bombs, and the life of a platoon there that entered the Bakhmut area was maybe 2 days. There was actually an example when drafting committee recruited somebody in Odessa, and next day by 3 p.m. he was already dead in Bakhmut without even having taken the military oath. And that was the furnace that they dropped our citizens into, our soldiers into. And we failed to create another third corps in the south. Doesn't mean that we would have significant success in the south if we did, but we chose to send these resources to Bakhmut. But, we could have achieved Tokmak, perhaps. That's a railroad, a transport center, and that would have changed the situation on the southern front. But in any case, we've lost in the south. It was a protracted story. And we also spent about 9 months defending that Fort Bakhmut, so to say. And the last 3 months, we should absolutely have not been doing that. It was not in our favor. The numbers were not in our favor. Given that a little further beyond Bakhmut, there are some heights. If we would have dug in there, we could have stopped the enemy significantly and captured them, trapped them in the lower lands. Yeah. Alexey, children, how do we get to this topic now? Back. Kids is the same theme, same motive. These guys in presidential office, they're about PR, in the worst sense of it. Not when they're highlighting the real achievement. Look how we can do the right things or the real things. There is an old Chinese saying that I've read a while ago, and I can just repeat it again. I think I mentioned it before in one of the streams. Chinese say that the hunter should be despised who is boasting at the feet of the tiger or lion who died at his own death. And the hunter, he can be glorified as long, and he can boast as long as he wants to at the feet of the animal that he had hunted. And the message is, as long as you actually have done it, you can boast the success for the whole life if you want to. But if something happened without you, you should not be using it as your prop. And that's the story with Zelensky and his team. They always find a semi-dead lion that can be used for all that PR maneuvering. They don't care about precursors. They don't care about the consequences. They only care about the moment. They've torn these kids from Austria, one of the better countries in Europe, with very good medicine, very good care, very neutral, very reliable, very good country to grow up in. And they bring them back under the missiles. For what? And the same people are saying that our military and civilians need rehabilitation services in Europe. Europe is not helping us enough. They have better prosthetics, they have better treatments, and yet the same people are sending their soldiers to Ukraine under fire. But they produced a flash in the media. Certain last names acquire certain political capital, that they did take care of kids somehow. And if not the sanctioned voices like yourself and myself, many people would have thought that it's good. And now we actually have a chance that some of them will pause and think that perhaps not everything is so dandy when you bring the kids back under the ballistic missiles. Alexey, 6,000 dead soldiers. At first they said soldiers, then later Medinsky said officers. There was some disconnect as to who these bodies are. But the message from Medinsky was that this was a humane gesture, basically bury them according to Christian traditions. We'll take them from our refrigerators, and he's saying that most of them are identified. And if Ukrainian side has some of the Russian soldiers collected on the fields, that they can transfer them to Russia. And Umerov comes out and says that they agreed to exchange 6,000 for 6,000. And around that, there is already some intrigue brewing. People started multiplying, calculating that 6,000, what ratio is from 15 million. And then President Zelensky comes and says that we only identified about 15% of the bodies, and very often we ended up having Russians giving us their own soldiers as if they were Ukrainian soldiers, dead bodies. Why do you think Zelensky is sending this weird message over the dead bodies? Why is he PRing himself on that? Alexander, does Ukraine conduct any diplomacy outside of diplomacy on the dead bodies for the last 3 years? I don't think so. It's all mixed with the trade of things related to death, trade of pity, trade of death. And if any of these kids, God forbid, perishes here in Ukraine, they will be pointing fingers and saying, look at these God-forsaken Russians, because they are responsible fully. But this is a long story. At the beginning of the initial negotiations back in 2022, we had several thousand of corpses of Russian troops in our refrigerators, and we offered them to exchange, to return them. In the first Istanbul, they refused at that time to receive them. It was a different phase of war, and they really did not want to highlight, that's my supposition, it's just my opinion. I think they did not want to have, at this time, we're talking about 6,500 corpses, and they did not know what to do with it. They were at a fork in the road, they were not sure, they want to add additional noise, and they refused to take them. But this number did not come out of nowhere, because Istanbul 25 is basically answers and controls to the questions that we posed back in 2022. So this time, that's why you see 6,000 for 6,000. And with Zelensky, I think everything is crystal clear in his politics. I think we can look at humanitarian component of this war. Why is Russian side now making these humanitarian gestures? To give some days to clean up the bodies and then to exchange them. I think after 3 years of different trials and errors in the apparatchik fight in Kremlin, humanitarian component is somewhat prevailing now. We have talked about that this war is probably the most humane in relation to civilians. If you take any war during the last 80 years, none other war had such a correlation between the dead bodies on the civilian side versus military. I think in Vietnam, for 28 dead partisans, there were over 100 civilians dying. Or out of 100, there were maybe like 28 possible partisans, the rest were civilians. I cannot really pull the exact number out of my memory, but something like that. This war is very different. And now we are facing a new humanitarian component where Russian side is coming and saying, let's exchange the bodies of the fallen soldiers. So one can ask a question, why are they doing it? Where from do we have the trend to humanize war? If you note, there is no additional missile strike on Kyiv, even though their ZE chats are now really boiling with demands to attack Kyiv or other cities after the last attack on their strategic bombers. Perhaps it'll happen, but until this moment, while we're recording the stream, nothing major was used as a retaliation on Ukraine. And there are civilians dying, of course, but in much smaller proportion to the military dying in this war. And now there is that humanitarian aspect to the fallen soldiers and the bodies on the battlefront. So what Russian Federation is demonstrating us, first of all, in this way? They're showing that this war, and I'll be just making my suppositions here, careful ones, but I think they're pointing that this war is somewhat special, and they very precisely differentiate Ukrainian population from Ukrainian leadership, and also Ukrainian population that was drafted to the army, who died at the front, and now they're ready to return them as a humanitarian gesture. I think this could be treated as a step towards the thesis that they're not fighting with Ukrainian people, that they're fighting with, how they call it, the Nazi power in Ukraine leadership. And that action of offering the bodies of dead Ukrainian soldiers means a lot for mothers of those soldiers, because it's always better to have some closure, right? It's difficult to even address this topic, but psychologically, biographically, it's different stuff. Even direct financial, by the way. You get certain money for the one who's MIA versus a much bigger payout for the one killed in action in Ukraine. So big difference for families. And emphasizing the humanitarian aspect of actions related to this warfare. This could be treated as part of that starting summer-autumn military campaign. It could be cynical, but what I would recommend those who like to think or who still remembers how to do that is that most likely such a step announced at the level of the leadership of Russian delegation. That means it was affirmed at the highest level in Russia. This is just the first step in a long chain of new narratives in dividing junta from the people. What will be the end of it, how it will come to a conclusion, we don't know. But I suspect, strongly suspect, that this vector will be built upon, and the story will be used as the woodcutter's tool to separate the interests of people from the interests of powers. Just like in those 17 Moments of Spring movie that I like to recall, where Müller is advising Stirlitz to not mix the interests of Germany with the interests of Führer. And Russia now is separating the interests of Ukrainian populace from the interests of some national battalions and some of the Zelensky anti-project leadership. Anti-Ukrainian project, as I call it. Most likely it will be not just diplomatic efforts. It might be resulting in some changes in the political goals and approach to these negotiations as well. One of the demands they're already posting is obligatory ask to give Russian language an official status in Ukraine. In Istanbul, they have 4 groups working: economic, military, humanitarian, and diplomatic, international relations and such. So humanitarian pays a huge attention to these elements. And looking at this from the intelligence point of view, whatever will be already is, they're already highlighting humanitarian component as one of the key elements today. And that implies the change of the approach to this war and the change of character of this war that will be more visible later. By autumn, we may hear a very different ultimatum. Second revised or third revised edition that will have a much bigger humanitarian component to it. And that in turn means that they have defined the projectivity for Ukraine, or the space that used to be Ukraine, for after the war period. We don't know what will be out of it, right? But you did ask me what will happen if Ukraine disappears. In my view, they're going to create 3 Ukraines. Ukraine occupied by Russia, the eastern Ukraine, imperial territories like Shelest mentioned in one of the streams recently, and then there'll be also the western component where all the Galician component should be moved out to, Lviv and all the western districts, and some neutral Ukraine. You can call it Rus Ukraine, you can call it Kievan Rus or Kievan Ukraine, but the logic is pretty clear. Russia wants to take the imperial lands where empire had invested a lot. It has historic character, it has access to transportation lines, owning certain territories that help them to further their imperial agenda. They also need to address somehow the Bandera, as they call them, Banderites. So they need to be pushed out to the west of Ukraine. Nobody wants to kill all of them. They just want to remove them from these territories that they occupy, and perhaps have some neutral territory, something like Bosnia, with a minimal army, neutral in a political status that exists in a certain status. That's a very interesting supposition, Alexey. I just want to clarify one thing here. An important question, I think. That Western Ukraine, with your easy nomenclature, and actually other experts are also calling it the Ukrainian Insurgency Army Dugout, do you think it'll let the central neutral Ukraine go? I don't think they will. Well, Alexander, they will not be asked. It will continue exacerbating, and I know Pavel Shelin, whom I respect to a degree. We did discuss with him a theory and that misspoken instance when presidential advisor of Russia did mention USSR as the single country regathered, and he was addressing the perspectives and how will Ukrainian people treat the solution to this war. For those who have not watched the stream, Pavel is saying that the main idea is that nothing in Ukraine belongs to its people anymore, and the only way to annul all these deals that sold a lot of lands and resources to BlackRocks and the like of the world is to acknowledge that USSR fell apart illegitimately. It doesn't mean to rebuild the USSR, but that it requires to annul all the contracts and deals that were signed during the last 30 years, and that basically returns all the lands to Ukraine ownership from anything that was or could have been signed during these years. So for me, looking at this from what will be already is, this is a serious sign of the paradigm, and paradigm to come, and I'm trying to grow it into a logical structure, and I can almost guarantee to 101%, especially that it is being reflected in the negotiations mode, that in Moscow they already came to some conclusion in the projectivity for Ukraine, and that's the direction that everything is going to now. The guarantor for existence of neutral Ukraine will be Russian Federation. The fellows from the insurgency army Dugout or Narrow project will be offered a very simple alternative to leave, because otherwise they will be eliminated. Nobody will be taking pity on them, because those that will move to the western Ukraine will not be considered brotherly nation. It'll be those whom they don't care about. You can dump Kinzhal or Oreshnik or other ballistics on them if they misbehave. The probability or likelihood for this country to survive and seriously resist Moscow between Poland, where elections were just very interesting recently, and Moscow and their encroachings on the east, that's a very questionable proposition. Therefore, the main two questions that we can see is, indeed, have they planned something like that? Is it true? Too many little signs indicate that it might be true, and especially knowing how they make decisions in Russia. Medinsky cannot bring anything to negotiations. He cannot even give away one single body of Ukrainian soldier unless Putin approved that. So it is all very hard driven from the top. And second, whether Russia will be able to support all these agreements if they come to life. But in order to provide for ownership in Ukraine for that peace deal, because they've went through that trap before, when Poroshenko and then Zelensky were saying that, sure, we'll agree to these terms with you, but our Congress will not sign it. We can ratify it and sign it here with you, but then Congress and Ukraine will not do that, because people in Ukraine and some national battalions will basically push the buttons of all politicians, so they cannot sign it. That's why don't demand it from us. We can, or we might sign it, but Ukrainian people won't. And Russians don't take it. They basically say, if you take an obligation, you are in charge of executing it. Otherwise, don't sign it. If you cannot control it, you are not a signatory. They have eaten that 3 times in different Minsk agreements from their point of view. And I think now, most likely what will happen is when, in some capacity, they'll sign a ceasefire agreement with the current power, with the new power, they'll be talking about a system of agreements between countries, that the system of collective security that will be established between Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine, whatever part of Ukraine, or several Ukraines, as a result of this war. Their main goal is that Russian-owned territories or Russian-occupied territories should be safe from Ukraine aggressions, encroachments. And that's why they're demanding no foreign armies, no European arms, no mass destruction weapons, to limit Ukrainian capacity to suddenly attack Russia. And by autumn, I think we'll see more demands that first, they will not allow military personnel to be part of negotiations, and second, any of the political national organization with nationalistic component. How much do you think it is possible to do in a whole Ukraine that is not split into portions? No, that's absolutely impossible, Alexei. Right. And in the neutral Ukraine, do you think that can be done? Depends. What do you consider to be neutral? What kind of Ukraine it is? Well, what Shelest says, take 9 or 10 central districts that used to be Getman state before. Everything that is in this region, everything opposing and vehemently fighting Russia will be pushed out to Galicia, to the west, and the middle Ukraine will likely be composed of those that want to live normally. I'm, by the way, one of them. Right, me too. An area that will be warm and sunny. And for such a buffer state, it's much easier to implement these demands. No nationalistic representatives, no military in the negotiations. So many plans announced as the plans for their special military operation, which are historically, politically, and technically are impossible to be implemented in the whole Ukraine, are very easy to be implemented in case Ukraine is split into 3 different states. And if they do not forfeit their goals, which seems they won't, very likely they won't, one can ask questions, what would be the way to execute that? And the level of politician is determined by ability to inherit his decisions or her decisions by the next generation of politicians. Because if one says that I signed something and after me somebody else comes and re-signs it, then one can ask a question, why did we agree to anything? Because now we need to fight over that thing again since you denounced the previous agreement. So they don't want that. And they want it to be inherited. They want political decisions to have some root. I'm not saying they will absolutely go this way, we don't know, but there are some signs that indicate that this is where they're heading to. And it's a very logical path. That is part of Ukraine, owned by Russia, some of the north, east, and some of the south, middle buffer state, and the insurgency dugout in the west. Nobody invents anything new. That was already done in Yugoslavia. Very cursory, roughly, but you basically can say that Serbia and Croatia were separated by Bosnia, which is more neutral. Russians were reviewing Yugoslavian experience very diligently. Their actions in Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine relies on the experience in Yugoslavia and in Kosovo precedent and the way that the West treated Yugoslavia. And there is some historic experience. One can remember Finnish leadership in exile. And they're playing this chess game. 3 Ukraines. I think it's with a very high probability. Alexei, I was planning to put this big topic towards the end of the stream. We'll talk about it, about today's attacks. But since we're at it here, since we already said A, let's say B. I want to say thank you everybody for watching us. 35,000 watching us live on my channel, 40,000 plus watching on Alexei's channel. Please, guys, watching the stream, do not forget to click the like button. That absolutely helps our sanctioned voices to be heard, both in Ukraine and overseas, wherever you guys are watching it. Regardless what VPN and how method you're using to watch the stream, if you're watching the original one, any like helps. And side note from Privateer Station, please do not forget to click the like and subscribe button. If you have not done that yet, that definitely helps our work to get wider audience. So thank you for being active and staying with us, all the viewers. And let's conclude this part of the stream with the following. You know, all these pollings, what will happen with Ukraine will be no more, what we started with. I have one older friend who is also sanctioned. I'm not going to name him, but we have argued with him for a long time already. We worked together, we've been colleagues, and we argued a lot. He is basically for Russian imperial project, and I was more pro-independent Ukraine. We had very interesting debates, and he knows me as a person who loves Ukraine. And recently, in a conversation, he did ask me, Alex, is that Ukraine that you loved still around? Does it exist? $1 million question. Right, Alex. Our Ukraine is not existing anymore. It's been trampled upon. And you and I are sanctioned and probably waiting to be called traitors and treasonous fellows as well. And let me open my cards here for those who might not have understood my position earlier. I am for a meta-civilization of Rus. For me, Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians are three groups of dummies who are failing to achieve the historical or ideal symbolic status of Russians, Rus, as I see them, as civilization of good and light and positive things, and they have a long way to go there. And I'm opening my cards here completely. Ideally, I'd want to have some of the midday world like Strugatsky described, only with God present in it, with Jesus Christ. Because without God, you cannot build it. And I'm looking at three brotherly nations equally, because each of them has their own deficiencies, has their own drawbacks. But for me, the war is a huge tragedy. It's a humongous tragedy because a brother is fighting a brother in this war. And for those who do not think so, I want to remind that, and that might be screaming before they go to that dugout, screaming, what brother is he talking about? I want to remind them that 10 million Ukrainians have immediate relatives in Russia. And it's not cousins, it's brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, and likewise on the other side. Whatever other politically you can append to that, it's still there. 10 million citizens have the closest ties between each other. That's why it pains me to see what's happening between these three countries. I feel for all three of them. And when one group of my own is killing another group of my own, this is a huge tragedy. Even though the world is full of civil warfare and to some degree the development of bigger Russia has been a chain of non-stop civil war. But it doesn't make it easier when one bunch of your own is killing another. How would I formulate it here? Give me a sec. When it is done because somebody on the West hired one group of relatives to kill another group of relatives or provoke them, I'm not even saying which ones. Because Russia also played its negative role. They played their experiments with joining with the West. They've been begging Europe to join them. They've been very pro-European. Putin suggested to create missile defense jointly. NATO had a base on Volga River. Yeah, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Exactly. They were lying down for the West, and they really wanted to join. And we also, of course, did in Ukraine. Only Belarus was somewhat taking a separate position, but they're also split. Part of them are very pro-Western, the others are with Lukashenko. And now that we are like those Indians, proverbial Indians, killing each other for the trinkets and the blankets, this is a huge tragedy. Another side of that tragedy is that we have to conduct negotiations, peace negotiations between our two countries in Istanbul. I admire modern Turkey. Osman Empire was interesting before, but the politics of today's Turkey is also very, very interesting. Because there were times when at some point in history, Belarus, Russians and Ukrainians jointly had won 26 wars over Turkey. And now in Turkey, we're asking them to help us strike peace accord. I have a question to all that meta-civilization, to all these relatives. I want to ask a question. Why did we fuck down to mice? Alexei, perhaps we do not have this meta-civilization anymore. Maybe it's already dismantled. Oh, it exists. Are you sure? Absolutely. It depends upon how you understand the wholesomeness. Look, the talking head or political leader or a citizen of a country can work to certain integral goal that has a symbolic and ethical character. Because even in Europe, they do change borders. We have an illusion that after war, Europe was very peaceful. No, they had 33 conflicts within the countries of NATO. The most obvious is Turkey and Greece. The least obvious is Gibraltar or Anglo-Icelandic wars over fish, Czechia and Slovakia, Yugoslavia. Germany, since 1919, had changed its government form 9 times. There's nothing more flexible as governmental shape, as the country shape. Post-war, post-Second World War was somewhat a slower time when they had just 2 pieces of Germany. That's why the thesis about immovable borders is idiotic, in my view, from the beginning. The goals are usually symbolic. The values are very symbolic. And if one says that there is no value in all these symbols, I do not even have to relate to the church and spiritual things, but I will use one argument here, and I'll use it again. Minimal losses among civilians. This is a miracle during the last 80 years of warfare. Iraq, Afghanistan, Salvador, Honduras, Syria, there was never anywhere a time when civilians were not dying in numbers more than military. The only exception would be Falkland Islands War, but there were no civilians there. And now we have the war on both sides, in Russia, in Ukraine, it spills to both countries, and yet the civilians are not leading in casualties. And this is one of the best indicators that this war is following very different principles that are different from any other kind of war. However much in Ukraine people would be giddy online when Russian tourist was eaten by shark somewhere, or in Russian, some Z channels, they would be screaming about killing everybody in Ukraine, we still have a material fact that needs some explanation, even if you're atheist and believing in symbolic capital. Why civilian casualties are so low in this war? Nothing like that existed in the last nearly complete century. And this is a very sad indicator that this is a special ethical process here and space here, and there are 2 forces fighting within this space that are fighting between each other mercilessly as military, but overall they're trying not to harm civilians too much. This is a negative example, but this is still an example of a special war in a special territory. That means there are some goals and some values behind it. So the question would be, who works for which value? And there is a joke, an anecdote about the difficult destiny of Ukraine, that the same family lived in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Soviet Union, and now in Ukraine without leaving Mukachevo. That's an illustration into our example. There is a special space that can change governmental forms, but its destiny and culture remains the same. So that family, or the Jews' version of this anecdote, is talking about a rabbi who's living in that township. So they have changed passports, right? When the countries were changing, every time they needed to declare the allegiance to the country, to the political body. One existed for 4 years, another for 10. But one can pose a question here. What is the goal of Ukrainian citizens these days? For example, what is the goal of Arestovych? To achieve the statehood of 1991? We'll never get back to 1991. That Ukraine that I love, that the way we could have created it, I love it, but it doesn't exist much anymore. And now I'm essentially denounced the right to be a citizen because I cannot come back. I am denounced all the financial operations in the country, and I'm under special sanctions. They just have not taken my passport away, but otherwise, de facto, they expelled me from citizenship. Somebody can ask, Arestovich, why you're not fighting on the front? Why would I fight on the front against my own, with my own against my own? For what? For a temporary government state that is sanctioning me and forbidding me to speak my language? What the heck for? This is absolutely illogical. In 1982, I made my choice when I saw the mosaics on one of the subway stations, Golden Gate Station in Kiev. I saw that this is my nation, a historic mosaic about the leaders of the past. And I do have the passport of Ukraine, right, but it doesn't change my deeper value. This war will continue until Belarus, Russians, and Ukrainians will come to realize that there is a special ethical and cultural space within which they should not be killing each other, regardless of how many countries exist within that space. A good example is Arabs. They have single cultural space and they have 19 different countries within that space. Israel, back in the days, had Israel and Judea had two pieces within one culture. How many English-speaking countries are in the world united by the same cultural space, from Australia to Canada? And in the world of special operations, there's a joke about British special ops who basically managed to convince the world that British Empire doesn't exist anymore, while all indicators are that it does. America, to some degree, is a part of this space. We can argue about its destiny, but still is somewhat related. So for me, the goal and the values have never changed. When people are accusing me of changing my clothes in a jump, or changing my political views on a whim, I'm not. It's not my responsibility or not my guilt that we're going through 3 different federal forms in this country during my lifetime. Tomorrow there may be 6 of them, and maybe they join again into one eventually. I do care about symbolic and unified phenomena that is called Rus. End of the first hour.